Chapter 5, Lesson 2, Life in New England. What to know? How did the Puritans' religious beliefs affect life and government in the New England colonies? Describe the religious beliefs and practices of the Puritans. Analyze the importance of town meetings and self-government in the English colonies. Describe how towns in New England were organized. Vocabulary that you can practice on Quizlet: common, town meeting, public office, places, Harvard University. You are there. You sit beside your mother on a hard wooden bench in church. Across the aisle, your father and the Puritan men and boys listen quietly to the sermon. The church is cold this morning, but a box of heated coals warms your feet. You watch the sand run down the hourglass on the minister's pulpit. His sermon has already lasted 3 hours. You try hard to stay awake, because if someone catches you napping, you'll be punished. You'll wish the Puritans were not so strict about behavior in church. Puritan ministers spent many hours preparing their Sunday sermons, which were delivered at churches like this one in Hingham, Massachusetts. You can see that here. Early New England colonists often carried their weapons with them wherever they went, including church. Think about why that might be. The first book printed in the English colonies was a prayer book, printed in Boston in 1630. A religious life. Please use this as a heading for your notes, or turn it into a question. How did the religious beliefs affect their daily lives? A religious life. The Puritans based every part of their lives on their Christian religious beliefs. Before taking any action, they thought about the Bible's laws. They also considered how they might be judged by God and by their community. Their religious beliefs determined how the Puritans lived, worked, and spent their free time. On Sundays, every person in a Puritan town had to attend church services. Puritan churches had no paintings, statues, or bells. The Puritans believed in simple religious practice. They thought that praying and reading the Bible were the best ways to worship God. A Puritan church service lasted for most of the day, with a break for a meal at noon. People sat on hard wooden benches and could not nap. I don't think you can nap at church now either. A person who fell asleep or did not behave properly was punished in front of everyone else. Okay, that's different. The Puritans harshly punished people who missed church or who spoke out in disagreement. The usual punishment for such behavior was several hours in the town stocks. In the stocks, now picture this in your head, in the stocks, a person's head, hands, and feet were locked uncomfortably into a wooden frame. Anyone who passed by could scold the person or throw food at them. The Puritans lived by strict rules. For example, they discouraged stage plays and card games. And keep in mind that we're talking about the 1600s, so some very famous playwrights had amazing plays available at that time. Think Shakespeare, right? But they discouraged these stage plays and they discouraged card games. They believed that such activities wasted time and dishonored God. Instead, they focused on working hard. How did religious beliefs of the Puritans affect their daily lives? Okay, so again, we have a lovely 2-page layout that gives you the parts of a New England town. So for example, here's the stocks, where people were punished publicly. You have the meeting house, the school, the mill, powered by water. And let's go back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Fields, the cooper, where they made barrels, the common, where people gathered, the well, and the general store. Okay, interesting. A New England town. Go ahead and use that as your heading, please. And if we take a quick look at the question at the end, why were town meetings important to New England colonists? Okay. What do we need to know about a New England town? Most people in colonial New England lived in small towns. The small size of a Puritan town made people feel that they belonged to a community. It also made it easier for them to help one another. People relied on their community for support. To be united, they lived, worked, and worshiped close together. At the center of each town was the common. This was a park-like area shared by all the townspeople and used for grazing cattle, sheep, and other livestock. The colonists built their houses along the sides of the common. Over time, the people added other buildings around the common. Larger towns in New England usually had an inn for travelers. In nearly every town, a school was built close to the common. Most towns also had a general store, a sawmill, and a blacksmith shop. To meet their economic wants, people in most small towns in the colonies depended on a system of barter. Instead of using money, people traded with each other for goods and services. Some colonists specialized in a certain type of work. As a result, colonists depended on one another as they bartered for things. For example, a blacksmith might make iron tools for his neighbor, the cooper. In exchange, the cooper might make barrels for the blacksmith, and then they would barter or trade them. Another building that stood near the common was the town's church, or meeting house. It was the center of town life because all religious services were held there. The meeting house was also where the Puritans took care of all town government. Everyone in the town could attend a town meeting, but only male church members were allowed to vote. By the end of the 1600s, though, any man who owned property could vote. However, women, indentured servants, and slaves were not allowed to vote. Every year, towns across New England held special town meetings at which voters elected people to public offices or jobs for the community. These jobs included constable, town crier, grave digger, and fence viewer. The constable's job was to maintain order and keep the peace. The town crier walked around town calling out important news for everyone to hear. The fence viewer made sure that all the fences around the crops were kept in good condition. Home life. What was home life like? Use this to set up your notes, please. The main room of a Puritan home had a large fireplace in which a fire was always kept burning. All cooking was done there. Most food was roasted over the fire or simmered in large iron kettles hung over the fire. Kettles were also used to heat water for cooking and washing. Baking was done in a small oven inside the fireplace. Women and girls spent many hours preparing food for their families. They also used churns to turn cream into butter. They dried and preserved fruits and pickled cabbages and other vegetables from their gardens. Pickling and storing fruits and vegetables in jars preserved the food so that it would last through the cold, hard winter. Consider there were no refrigerators. You couldn't go to the grocery store year-round and get fresh fruit like we can here. So if they wanted any produce over the long, cold, hard winter, they had preserved foods. Women and girls also made the simple clothing worn by most colonists. As fabric was limited, even pieces of worn-out clothing were used to make new clothing and patchwork quilts to put on beds. Nothing useful went to waste. Women and girls made many other items that their families used every day. They used animal fat to make soap and candles, and they used pig bristles or hair to make brushes. Women also took care of the children, and most Puritan families had 7 or more children. Men and boys hunted for food, furs, and hides. They cut firewood and made most of their own tools from wood. Historical reenactors, such as these women, work at museums and living history sites to show how people lived in the past. Democratic values. We're going to come back to this. Let's continue. Men and boys hunted for foods, furs, and hides. They cut firewood and made most of their own tools from wood. The men also took turns patrolling the borders of the town. Most men and boys spent their days working in the fields outside the town. After clearing trees and rocks from the land, they plowed the soil and planted crops. The colonists grew corn, wheat, rye, and barley. Among the rows of corn, farmers also grew pumpkins and squash. They had learned some of their farming methods from the Wampanoag Indians. Each autumn, all the people in town worked together to harvest the crops. They sent some of these crops to England in exchange for things such as paper, lead, and paint. They also sent crops to English colonies on the Caribbean islands in exchange for sugar. The Puritans raised cattle, cows, hogs, pigs, and sheep as sources of food, leather, and wool. They made their own shoes from leather and wore warm clothing made from sheep's wool. Life was difficult for the early Puritans, but they still found time for some leisure activities. Children usually had few toys, but they enjoyed playing games and sports. At night, families sat around the fire to read the Bible or other religious books. Often, the Puritans' leisure time combined play with work. For example, some children liked to fish and hunt, and others enjoyed sewing and quilt making. And consider how women contributed as well as how the men contributed. They had their own contributions they each made. And go ahead and read this one. Democratic values. The United States has a long tradition of representative government. In New England town meetings, voters elected leaders for the whole colony. Each town in Massachusetts helped choose the governor. Voters also elected 2 people from their town to represent them in the colonial government. The governor, his assistants, and an assembly of town representatives formed the General Court, which passed laws and made decisions for the colony. Most New England colonies had similar forms of government. However, their charters all said they had to be loyal to the English government. Keep that in mind as we get into our next unit. Schools. We set this up on our notes. That's our heading. What were schools like in Puritan times? Might be a question you could ask. We can also look ahead to see. This is a good one. Why was education important for the Puritans? Schools. Schools were very important to the Puritans because they believed that every person should be able to read. Every person should be able to read. Read what? Every person should be able to read the Bible. And keep in mind the historical context that we're just 100 years after the printing press was invented, and for the first time, books are relatively easy to print and they are affordable to the average person, whereas before they were only in the hands of the very wealthy or the very, very well educated. Okay. So at first, Puritan parents taught their children at home or sent them to home schools. Homeschooling. Then in 1647, Massachusetts passed a new law saying that every town with at least 50 families must have a school. All the other New England colonies, except Rhode Island, passed similar laws. As a result, the New England colonies had more schools than any of the other English colonies. Puritan schools were among the first public schools in the English colonies. A typical school had only one room and one teacher. Most teachers were men, and many of them were very strict. Some often whipped, like with a whip, whipped students for bad behavior or even for a wrong answer. The main subject taught in Puritan schools was reading, and many children used a school book called the New England Primer or Primer. In colonial days, paper and ink were very expensive, so most students learned to read from a hornbook. This was a piece of paper showing the alphabet that was attached to a paddle-shaped frame. To protect it, the paper was covered with a thin, clear sheet of animal horn, sliced so thin that a person could see right through it. Few Puritan children went to the church for very long because their parents wanted them to help at home and on the farm. Many Puritans thought that learning how to read was enough education for most people. Some boys, however, continued their education. They went to grammar schools, where they prepared to attend college. In 1636, we'll get back to this. In 1636, the Puritans founded Harvard College, now Harvard University, to train ministers, religious leaders. It was the first college in the English colonies, and in its first year, it had only 9 students. However, like the colonies, it would grow steadily through the 1600s and 1700s. Again, why was education important for the Puritans? And let's go ahead and look at that primary source again. Harvard, how it used to look. Okay, this is what a horn book actually looked like. So it's a piece of paper, okay, and then a thin sheet of horn, okay, kind of like old school lamination here with a little bit of an edging to protect it so that this would last and last and last and last, because paper and ink were very expensive. Notice what's on here. The alphabet, capitals and lower cases. Actually, lowercase first and then capitals, vowels, and then notice, I think it's short vowel, long vowel, and then word families, similar to perhaps what you learned in 1st or 2nd grade, and then a prayer, the Lord's Prayer. So that is what they use to teach children to read. Think about how fortunate you are and all the many, many, many things you have to read. Summary. The Puritan way of life was based on religion. Religious beliefs also influenced Puritan laws and government. New England colonists believed in the importance of education, so most towns had schools. Okay, so questions to review and think about for discussion. How did Puritans' religious beliefs affect life and government in the New England colonies? Write a sentence describing what a town meeting might have been like. In what ways did New England colonists practice self-government? How were the people of New England colonies able to get the goods and services they needed? And then, how was an early New England town like your town? How was it different?